Part 1. The Galactic Council chamber floated in the empty space between distant stars, a massive station that had seen 1,000 different species come to pledge their loyalty to peace and cooperation across the galaxy. And today it would witness something that nobody had expected or prepared for in any way. Something that would change how every species looked at the newcomers from the small blue planet called Earth. Commander Daniel Hayes stood perfectly still in the human delegation quarters. His dress uniform was clean and pressed with sharp creases in all the right places, and beside him stood Lieutenant Sophie Martinez, who kept looking down at the data tablets in her hands, her fingers shaking just a little bit because she knew what was about to happen and what it would mean for everyone involved in this historic moment. Sophie spoke in a quiet voice that barely carried across the small room where they waited. She said that the other species in the council thought humans were primitive and backwards, that the preliminary reports from the various alien governments had called the human military adequate for a developing species, which was their polite way of saying they thought Earth's defenders were weak and unprepared for real galactic threats. Daniel allowed himself to show a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told Sophie to let them think that way for just a little bit longer, because very soon they would learn the truth about what humanity had become through thousands of years of constant warfare and survival against impossible odds. The official summons from the Galactic Council had arrived exactly 3 weeks ago, delivered by a diplomatic courier ship that had jumped into Earth's orbit and transmitted the formal request. And the message had been clear and direct in its purpose, stating that the Council, in their great wisdom, had decided it was finally time to properly evaluate and assess humanity's military capabilities now that Earth had been a member of the galactic community for 5 whole years. During those 5 years since first contact, humanity had played their cards very close to their chest, never revealing the full extent of their military preparation or the true nature of their defensive capabilities. And the major council species, like the Zorvath Confederation and the Kelthian Empire and the United Clans of Dravos, had all submitted their own evaluations and assessments of what they thought Earth's defensive capabilities actually were. Every single report from every single species had been dismissive and condescending, treating humanity like children who had just learned to walk among the stars. Ambassador Helen Curtis entered the small waiting room with purposeful steps. Her gray hair was pulled back in a severe and professional bun that made her look even more serious than usual, and she had been serving as humanity's chief diplomat for the past 3 years, during which time she had grown increasingly tired of the patronizing attitudes from species that had apparently forgotten what it truly meant to fight for survival. Helen looked at both Daniel and Sophie with steady eyes and told them it was time. She reminded them to remember the plan, to show the council representatives everything without holding anything back, because the alien governments had asked for a full and complete military assessment, and that was exactly what they were going to receive, whether they liked the results or not. Daniel gave a sharp nod of agreement and understanding. He knew that the council had asked for this evaluation, and now they would get one that would probably keep their diplomats busy for months, trying to process all the implications. The 3 human representatives made their way through the crystalline corridors of the massive council station, passing by alien species of every possible description and body type imaginable. Some of these beings offered polite nods of acknowledgement as the humans passed by, while others simply ignored them completely because humanity was still considered the new species in galactic terms, the young upstart civilization that had barely mastered faster than light travel and didn't really deserve much attention. The council chamber itself was absolutely breathtaking in its design and construction. It was a perfectly circular room with a transparent floor made of some material that was stronger than steel but clear as glass. And this floor looked down into the infinite void of deep space where stars glittered like scattered diamonds, while the walls around them rose up in tiered seating, arrangements that could accommodate all the various species, representatives in their different physical forms. At the very center of this impressive chamber was a raised platform where the species currently under review would stand and present their case to the assembled council members. High Counselor Thexaron of the Zorvath species towered over the entire assembly with his impressive height. His 4 powerful arms were folded across his chitinous chest in a pose that suggested both authority and a certain degree of impatience, and his translator collar glowed with a soft blue light as he spoke in his own language, which the device instantly converted into words that all species could understand. The High Counselors. Translated voice announced that the council was now convening to formally assess the military capabilities of the human species from the planet called Earth. He explained that this evaluation would determine what defensive assignments humanity would receive and what contributions they would be expected to make to the Council's combined security forces, and he invited Ambassador Curtis to step forward and begin her presentation. Helen walked onto the central platform with confident steps, while Daniel and Sophie took up positions on either side of her, forming a united front, and Helen touched her data tablet with one finger, which caused holographic displays to suddenly erupt all around them in glowing three-dimensional images that filled the air. Helen began to speak in a voice that was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the vast chamber. She thanked the honored council members for this opportunity and acknowledged that humanity understood their species was young by galactic standards, having been spacefaring for less than a single century, and members of this council for only 5 years. But she suggested that perhaps the council might have significantly underestimated exactly what humanity could bring to the table. A ripple of what might have been quiet amusement passed through the assembled alien representatives at Helen's words, and Counselor Veshtara of the Kelthian Empire, who was a being that resembled a large floating jellyfish made of luminescent blue light, pulsed with colors that the translator interpreted as mild condescension as she spoke, saying that young species very often had a tendency to overestimate their own capabilities, and asking Helen to please enlighten them all. Daniel stepped forward with military precision in every movement. His posture was perfectly straight, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades in uniform, and he asked a simple question that seemed innocent enough, wanting to know how many actual wars the average council species had fought during the last 1,000 years of galactic history. The massive council chamber fell completely silent at this unexpected question. Nobody had been expecting the humans to start with something like this. High Counselor Thexaron's translator collar flickered for just a moment, as if processing something difficult, and then he responded by explaining that the Galactic Council had been specifically formed to prevent wars from happening, and that most member species had perhaps engaged in 2 or possibly 3 minor conflicts during the entire 1,000-year time frame that Daniel had mentioned. And these conflicts were usually just border disputes or operations to suppress piracy in remote sectors. Daniel let his next words hang in the air for maximum dramatic effect before continuing. He stated that in the last 1,000 years of human history, humanity as a species had fought approximately 471 major wars, and he emphasized that this number only counted the major conflicts, because if they included all the smaller regional conflicts and brief skirmishes and what humans called police actions, then the actual number would exceed 15,000 separate armed conflicts. The silence in the chamber became so complete that someone could have heard a pin drop on the transparent floor. Sophie brought up the holographic display controls and showed a rotating 3-dimensional image of planet Earth turning slowly in space, and then red dots began to appear on the surface of the planet, with each dot representing a location where warfare had occurred, and within just a few seconds the entire globe was completely covered in overlapping crimson markers that made it look like the planet was bleeding. Sophie continued the presentation by explaining that humanity had been at war with itself for the entire span of recorded history, that humans had fought over land and resources and ideology and religion, and sometimes for reasons that even they themselves could barely remember or understand. And she said that humanity had been tempered and shaped by fire since before they even understood what fire actually was. Helen took control of the presentation again, and her voice remained steady even though she could see the shock spreading across the alien faces throughout the chamber. She told the assembled council members that they needed to understand something fundamental about humanity, which was that war was not something humans studied as a theoretical exercise or an abstract concept. Instead, it was woven into the very fabric of their species like threads and cloth that could never be separated. She explained that every human culture throughout history had produced warriors and soldiers, that every human language contained dozens or even hundreds of different words for conflict and battle and warfare, and she emphasized that humanity did not simply have a military tradition like some species might have, but rather that humanity itself was a military tradition that had evolved over countless generations. The holographic displays surrounding the 3 human representatives suddenly shifted and changed. and the first new image that materialized in the air made several council members lean forward in their seats with sudden interest. Because what they were seeing was a ship unlike anything in the standard council fleet designs. Daniel began explaining what they were looking at. He said this was the UES Endeavor, which was classified as a standard human heavy destroyer. Nothing special or experimental, just a regular ship that any human fleet would have multiple copies of, and he pointed out the armor plating that covered the hull. Explaining it was a composite material made from titanium and ceramic hybrid construction that measured 20 meters thick at the most critical structural points. He went on to describe how, beneath that outer armor layer, there existed an entire network of self-sealing bulkheads that would automatically close if the hull was breached. And he stated clearly that the ship had been designed from the ground up to take enormous amounts of punishment and still keep fighting, long after other vessels would have been destroyed. Counselor Drex of the Dravos clans made a dismissive gesture with his clawed hand. The reptilian being with bronze-colored scales said that the armor sounded impressive for such a new species, but that their own cruisers carried similar levels of protection, so this was not particularly remarkable. Sophie interjected quickly and respectfully. She brought up comparative data on the holographic displays that showed the differences between human and council ship designs, and she explained that council cruisers carried defensive plating that was specifically designed to deflect or dissipate energy-based weapons like plasma, cannons, or particle beams. She continued by pointing out that the Endeavor's armor was fundamentally different because it had been designed to survive kinetic impacts and thermal weapons and electromagnetic pulse attacks and chemical weapons and biological contamination and sustained nuclear bombardment. And the reason for this comprehensive protection was simple. Humanity had built these ships to fight against other humans, and humans were extremely creative when it came to finding new ways to destroy things. The holographic display zoomed in to show close-up details of the weapons systems mounted on the destroyer's hull, and Daniel described the primary armament, which consisted of 12 separate railgun batteries positioned at strategic points around the ship. He explained that each battery could fire a depleted uranium slug at approximately 7% of light speed, and the kinetic energy released when one of these projectiles hit a target was equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. Counselor Veshitara pulsed with skeptical colors that her translator interpreted as doubt. She said that railguns were primitive kinetic weapons that most civilized species had abandoned many thousands of years ago in favor of much more advanced plasma, weaponry, or particle beam technology. Daniel smiled in a way that made several council members feel slightly uncomfortable. He acknowledged that most species had indeed abandoned railgun technology, but he explained they had done so because railguns were extremely difficult to aim accurately, and even harder to provide with sufficient power. But humanity had perfected them specifically because they needed ship-killing weapons that could not be deflected by energy shields or intercepted by point defense systems. He stated flatly that a railgun slug traveling at that velocity simply did not care about electromagnetic shielding or hull polarization or any other defensive measure because it just punched straight through everything in its path using nothing but raw kinetic force. Helen brought up actual footage from human naval war games, real combat recordings that showed what these weapons could do in practice, and the council members watched with growing concern as a railgun round struck a decommissioned frigate that had been set up as a target. But the ship did not explode in the dramatic fashion that most council weapons would have caused. Instead, the railgun slug simply punched a hole through one side of the frigate and came out the other side, and the sheer kinetic energy transfer caused the entire vessel to begin spinning violently in space before secondary explosions from ruptured fuel lines and power conduits finally tore the ship into pieces. Sophie continued the weapons overview by describing the missile systems that human ships carried, but she was careful to explain that these were not the kind of missiles that council species were familiar with, because human missiles carried variable payload configurations that could be changed based on mission requirements. She listed the different warhead types available, including high explosive and armor-piercing and electromagnetic pulse and fragmentation and thermobaric and fusion warheads, and she explained that each missile was equipped with adaptive artificial intelligence that could adjust its approach vector up to 3,000 times per second in order to avoid or overcome countermeasures. The display showed a simulation of a missile swarm attack, where dozens of missiles weaved through heavy point defense fire their flight paths creating an impossibly complex web of trajectories before they all slammed into their designated target within a fraction of a second. Daniel said that ships and their weapons were only part of the complete picture, and now it was time to talk about the ground forces, specifically the human Marines who would actually board enemy vessels or defend against invasion. The holographic display shifted again to show a human soldier standing in full combat armor, and the figure rotated slowly in 3 dimensions, so that the council members could examine every single detail of the equipment. Daniel explained that this was the standard issue combat armor for the Earth Defense Force. Nothing experimental or reserved for special operations, just what every regular Marine would wear into battle. And he described how the armor was actually a powered exoskeleton that provided a force multiplication factor of 12 to 1. He told them that the soldier wearing this armor could run at speeds of 60 kilometers per hour on flat ground, could jump 4 meters straight up into the air, and possessed enough strength to punch through reinforced steel plating with their bare hands. Sophie added more technical details about the armor's construction, describing how it was built in layers with an outer ablative plating designed to dissipate energy weapon hits, a middle layer for kinetic dispersal that spread impact forces across the entire suit, and an inner life support system that could sustain the soldier in hard vacuum or underwater, or in toxic atmospheres for up to 72 continuous hours. She went on to describe the weapon loadout that each individual soldier carried, explaining that human Marines were equipped with firepower that most Council species would classify as crew-served weapons or vehicle-mounted systems, but humans considered them standard infantry equipment. The standard assault rifle fired caseless ammunition at a rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, with smart targeting systems that linked directly to the visual array built into the helmet, and the effective range in atmosphere was 2,000 meters, which was far beyond what most species considered possible for a personal weapon. Counselor. Thexaron's translator crackled with what might have been disbelief as he asked if humanity really armed their individual foot soldiers with such overwhelming firepower. Helen replied calmly that humans armed their soldiers for survival, because they had learned through bitter experience over thousands of years that the military force which brought overwhelming firepower to the battlefield was usually the force that survived to go home to their families. She told the council that she wanted to show them what human Marines could actually do in combat situations, and the holographic display began playing footage from training exercises. The council members watched as human soldiers moved through hostile terrain with a fluid precision that looked almost like a carefully choreographed dance. They breached fortified positions using precisely placed shaped charges. They cleared rooms full of simulated enemies with ruthless efficiency, and they coordinated fire support and tactical movements with an instinctive understanding that could only come from generations of accumulated warfare experience. But it was the next recording that caused visible alarm among several of the council representatives, because this footage showed a full squad of human Marines facing off against combat drones, automated defense systems that the council itself used for training their own security forces. These machines were considered state-of-the-art technology. They had been programmed with the combat doctrines and tactical knowledge of over 100 different species, and they were designed to be nearly impossible to defeat in direct combat. The human Marines destroyed every single drone in exactly 90 seconds. High Counselor Thexaron rose slowly from his seat, with all 4 of his arms gesturing in what his species considered to be a diplomatic sign of serious concern, and he told Ambassador Curtis that while the council appreciated the thoroughness of her presentation, he felt obligated to voice the growing unease that was spreading through the chamber like ripples in water. The High Counselor continued by saying that humanity appeared to have devoted an extraordinary and perhaps excessive portion of their total resources and attention to warfare and military preparation, and he reminded everyone present that the Galactic Council's fundamental purpose was to promote peace and cooperation and mutual prosperity among all species. But the human presentation seemed to suggest a civilization that glorified conflict rather than avoided it. Helen had been expecting exactly this kind of response because she had watched the alien faces carefully throughout the presentation. She had seen the growing concern in their expressions and body language, and she had noticed how the counselors' translated words were starting to carry an edge of fear beneath all the diplomatic Politeness, Helen asked politely if she might be permitted to tell the High Counselor a story that might help explain humanity's perspective, and Thexaron settled back into his seat and gestured for her to proceed with whatever she wanted to say. Helen began her story by describing events from 300 years in Earth's past. She told them about a human nation that had been called Germany, and how it had started a war that eventually consumed their entire planet in flames and death. And she said that 60 million human beings had died in just 6 years of continuous fighting. She described how entire cities had been reduced to piles of smoking rubble, how whole populations had been systematically murdered in what humans called genocide, and how humanity had developed weapons so terrible that they could burn entire cities to ash and dust in a single instant of nuclear fire. The holographic displays shifted to show historical footage that made several council members visibly recoil, because the images showed cities that had been turned into wastelands, mass graves that stretched as far as the eye could see, and the distinctive mushroom cloud of atomic weapons rising into the sky like monuments to destruction. Helen continued by explaining that when that horrible war had finally ended, humanity had looked at what they had done to themselves and to their own planet, and they had been forced to make a choice about what kind of species they wanted to become. She said that some humans had argued they should disarm completely, that they should abandon all their weapons and hope that peace would naturally follow from this act of faith, and for a while this idea had gained considerable support among war-weary populations. But Helen explained that humanity had ultimately learned a much harder and more painful lesson through all that blood and suffering. They had learned that evil truly existed in the universe, that there would always be individuals and groups who sought to dominate and conquer and destroy others, and most importantly, they had learned that the only thing capable of stopping evil was good people who were willing and able to fight back. Sophie stepped forward and added her voice to the explanation. She said that every single human soldier took a sacred oath when they joined the military, but this oath was not about conquest or glory or the celebration of war. Instead, it was an oath to protect those who could not protect themselves. Sophie told the council that humanity maintained its powerful military, not because they loved violence or enjoyed killing, but because they loved all the things that violence destroyed. They loved their families and their homes and their freedom, and their ability to live without fear. And she emphasized that humans were warriors, specifically so that other people could be poets and teachers and farmers and artists. Daniel said he wanted to show the council something else that might change their perspective, and he pulled up new statistical data on the holographic displays, showing detailed records of human military interventions over the past 100 years since Earth had finally unified all its nations under a single planetary government. The data clearly showed that offensive wars started by humanity during this period totaled exactly 0, while military actions taken to defend allied nations or to respond to humanitarian crises numbered 37, and perhaps most tellingly, the percentage of human military personnel who volunteered for dangerous peacekeeping operations was 100% of those who were assigned to such duties. The display began showing different images. Now, pictures of human soldiers doing things that had nothing to do with combat. There were Marines distributing food to refugees, engineers building schools in devastated areas, medics providing care to injured civilians, and soldiers playing with children or helping elderly beings cross dangerous terrain. Helen pointed out that these were the exact same Marines who had just demolished sophisticated combat drones with ruthless efficiency in the earlier footage, but now they were shown in moments of compassion and care, and she said this duality was the true nature of humanity. She told the council that humans were indeed a warrior species, but they were not a violent species, and she emphasized that there was a fundamental difference between these two concepts that many species failed to understand. Helen explained that a violent species fought because they enjoyed destruction and chaos, because violence itself gave them pleasure, but a warrior species fought only because they had to, because there were things in the universe worth dying for and worth killing to protect. She said that humanity trained constantly for war specifically so that they might preserve peace for as long as possible, and that every weapon they built and every soldier they trained was ultimately in service of preventing conflict rather than starting it. Counselor Veshtara pulsed thoughtfully with colors that suggested she was reconsidering her initial assessment, but she still said that Helen spoke very eloquently and persuasively. However, eloquence alone could not change certain fundamental facts. The counselor pointed out that humanity represented an unknown factor in galactic politics, that they possessed military capabilities which appeared to exceed most council member states, despite being centuries behind in overall technological development, and that they seemed to compensate for their technological limitations with what could only be described as brutality of design. Veshatara stated plainly that this combination of factors concerned many council members greatly, and she asked what assurances humanity could provide that they would not eventually turn all these impressive weapons against other council species. Helen replied by addressing that concern with complete directness. She said that the council wanted to know if humanity could be trusted with the military power they possessed. They wanted to know if humans would turn their weapons on peaceful neighbors, and she proposed to answer these questions with some questions of her own. Helen asked how many conflicts humanity had started since joining the council 5 years ago, and after a moment of silence, Thexarin admitted the answer was none. Helen asked how many times humanity had threatened to use military force against another member state, and again the answer came back as none. Helen then asked how many times humanity had offered military assistance when other species had requested help, and Counselor Drex's translator crackled as he responded that human defense forces had assisted with piracy suppression operations in the Kelthian border regions 7 separate times, had provided armed escort services for vulnerable colony transports, and had deployed engineering teams to repair damaged stations after accidents. Helen told the assembled council that humanity was not asking them to trust blindly without evidence. Instead, humans were asking to be judged by their actual actions rather than by fears about what they might theoretically do in the future. She acknowledged that yes, humanity were warriors, and yes, they had capabilities that might seem frightening to species who had lived in relative peace for centuries, but she insisted that humans had proven through both their long history and their recent conduct that they could be trusted to use those capabilities responsibly and only when absolutely necessary. Sophie pulled up one final document on the holographic display, and she explained that this was a human text that had been written over 230 years ago, right after the worst war humanity had ever fought, and it had been called the United Nations Charter, before later becoming the foundation for the Earth Defense Covenant. The text appeared in the air, automatically translated into all the various council languages so everyone could read it. And it said that the peoples of Earth were determined to save future generations from the scourge of war, which had brought untold sorrow to humankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the dignity and worth of every person. Helen said softly that humanity had written these words while standing in the ashes of their greatest conflict, that they had written it because they understood that strength without purpose was nothing but tyranny, and that they maintained their military not to project power across the galaxy, but to ensure that never again would their species be at the mercy of those who would destroy them. She added that now that humanity was part of a galactic community, that same protective instinct extended to their allies and neighbors among the stars. The 6 hours of deliberation felt like 6 entire days to the human delegation as they waited in their assigned quarters, reviewing their presentation over and over again, second-guessing every decision they had made, and trying very hard not to let their anxiety show on their faces or in their body language. Commander Daniel Hayes stood at the large viewport that looked out into space, watching the various ships coming and going from the massive council station, and he thought about how somewhere out there in the political chambers of this station, humanity's entire future in the galactic community was hanging in the balance like a sword suspended by a single thread. The humans had shown their strength to the council. They had revealed capabilities that most species probably found shocking or even frightening, but Daniel knew that strength could be interpreted in 2 completely different ways. It could be seen as a deterrent that promoted respect, or it could be seen as a threat that demanded isolation. Sophie broke the heavy silence by asking if Daniel thought they had gone too far with the presentation, if perhaps they had revealed too much too quickly, and her voice carried the weight of doubt that all 3 humans were feeling. Helen looked up from her data tablet where she had been reviewing diplomatic protocols, and she said that they had shown the council nothing but the truth about humanity, and if the truth was too much for the alien species to handle, then humanity was never going to fit into this galactic community. Anyway, no matter what they did. Daniel turned away from the viewport and said that he kept thinking about the expressions on the council members' faces during the presentation, especially when the humans had shown them the planetary defense cannons and detailed the intensive training regimen that every Marine went through. And he said those alien faces had not just shown surprise, they had shown genuine fear. Helen replied that fear could lead to respect if handled properly, but she acknowledged that it could just as easily lead to isolation and mistrust, and she said they were about to find out which direction the council would choose. A soft chime sounded at the door of their quarters, and a council aide entered the room. This being was a small insectoid creature with delicate crystalline wings that caught the light, and it bowed in the formal manner of its species before announcing that the council had concluded its deliberations and that the human delegation's presence was requested. Immediately in the main chamber, the walk back through the crystalline corridors to the council chamber felt completely different this time. The hallways seemed longer somehow. The other species they passed seemed more distant, or perhaps that was just Daniel's imagination playing tricks on him because of the stress and uncertainty. They entered the council chamber to find all the major representatives already assembled and waiting. Their expressions were carefully controlled and unreadable, which made it impossible to guess what decision they had reached during their long deliberation. High Counselor Thexaron stood with all four of his arms held in a formal position that indicated he was about to make an official proclamation, and he addressed the three humans by their names and titles, saying that the council had carefully reviewed their presentation and had conducted extensive deliberations about what they had learned. The High Counselor said that what humanity had shown them today had fundamentally altered the council's understanding of the human species in ways that would have seemed impossible just a few hours earlier. Thexaron continued by stating that humanity's military capabilities exceeded the council's previous estimates by a factor of 12, that human soldiers were more extensively and intensively trained than any fighting force in recorded council history, that human weapon systems demonstrated a level of practical lethality that most species would consider excessive or even barbaric, and that human civilization appeared to be organized around the concept of perpetual military readiness. The counselor paused after saying all this, and in that brief moment of silence, Daniel felt like the entire future was shifting and changing, like reality itself was holding its breath waiting to see what would happen next. Thexaron said that this level of military focus could be absolutely terrifying to peaceful species, that a civilization this martially inclined could potentially pose an existential threat to galactic peace and stability. However, the Council had also carefully reviewed humanity's history and cultural documents and conduct since joining the Council 5 years ago. He said that the Council had deliberated extensively on the question that mattered most, which was not how dangerous humanity was in terms of raw capability, but rather how humans chose to use that danger and what their ultimate goals and motivations were. Counselor Veshitara pulsed with colors as she took over speaking, and she said that the council had concluded that humanity did not develop their impressive military capabilities for purposes of conquest or expansion, but rather they had developed them out of absolute necessity for survival against themselves during thousands of years of internal conflict. She stated that humans were warriors born from necessity rather than choice, and this was a crucial distinction that changed everything about how the council should view them. Counselor Drex stood next, and his translator carried what might have been approval in its tone. He said that despite humanity's overwhelming military superiority in many specific areas, they had not sought to exploit this advantage for personal gain. They had not demanded better trading terms or more favorable territory, or special privileges that other species did not receive. Drex pointed out that humanity had actually offered their strength and service to other species on multiple occasions, providing protection and assistance without asking for anything in return, and this pattern of behavior suggested a level of wisdom and restraint that was rare among powerful species. High Counselor Thexaron spoke again and announced that the Council had reached a final decision. He said that humanity's defensive evaluation rating had been updated from Category 5 all the way up to Category 1, and that Earth would now be officially recognized as a primary military power within the Council's organizational structure. Daniel felt Sophie grip his arm tightly in surprise because Category 1 status was reserved exclusively for the oldest and most powerful and most respected species in the entire galaxy. Species like the Zorvath and the Kelthian, and the Dravos clans who had been spacefaring for thousands of years, and now humanity was being placed in that same elite category. Thexaron continued by explaining that with this recognition came significant responsibility. He said that the Council was formally requesting that Earth commit dedicated military forces to serve as a rapid response fleet, and that humanity would be called upon whenever situations arose that required immediate and decisive action to protect Council interests. He stated that humans would be expected to help maintain peace and security throughout Council-controlled space, responding to threats that the regular peacekeeping forces were not equipped to handle. Helen stepped forward and said that the people of Earth were deeply honored by this recognition from the Council, and that humanity accepted all the responsibilities that came with their new status. However, she said she needed to ask a direct question about what had changed. Helen pointed out that just 6 hours earlier, the Council had seemed very concerned that humanity was too dangerous and too focused on warfare, so she wanted to know what had happened during the deliberations that had shifted their perspective so dramatically. It was Counselor Drex who chose to answer this question, and his translator carried what sounded like amusement as he explained that the Council had accessed humanity's complete historical databases during the deliberation period, all of them without any restrictions, and they had studied human wars and conflicts and the endless cycle of violence and peace that had defined Earth's history. Drex said that the Council had found something completely unexpected in those records, something that had changed how they viewed everything else about humanity. The central holographic display suddenly activated without anyone touching the controls, and it began showing images from human history. There were soldiers sharing their limited food rations with starving children in war zones. There were former enemies helping each other rebuild after devastating battles. There were monuments to peace built cooperatively by nations that had been trying to destroy each other just years earlier. Drex continued by saying that despite all the violence and despite all the wars and despite all the death, humanity had never stopped reaching for peace. They had fought terrible battles, but they had also forgiven their enemies. They had destroyed cities, but they had also rebuilt them. They had killed each other by the millions, but then they had worked together to ensure it would never happen again. He said that humanity was the only species in all of Council records to have fought a truly global war that consumed their entire planet, and then to have unified peacefully under a single government within just a single generation after that war. Ended Counselor Veshtara pulsed in agreement and said that most species achieved lasting peace only through complete exhaustion or through near extinction, but humanity had achieved it through conscious choice and determination, and this was genuinely remarkable and suggested a moral strength that matched their military strength. Thexaron added that the Council had also carefully reviewed an incident from 17 months ago involving a colony ship accident in the Kepler system, and Daniel immediately remembered what the Counselor was referring to because every human in the Defense Forces knew that story. A civilian transport carrying thousands of Kelthian colonists had suffered a catastrophic reactor failure in deep space, and the nearest potential help had been a human science vessel called the UES Discovery that was conducting stellar surveys several days away at maximum speed. Thexaron said that the human ship had arrived at the disaster site in just 18 hours, which should have been completely impossible by any normal calculations, and the Council now understood why this had been possible. The High Counselor explained that the human captain had ordered his ship into an extremely dangerous gravity slingshot maneuver around a nearby stellar body, pushing the engines far past their safety limits, and gambling everything on a series of precision jumps that could have easily destroyed the vessel and killed everyone aboard. Helen said quietly that she knew Captain Ryan Bennett personally, that he was a good man and an excellent officer, and she added that he had not even hesitated for a second when the distress call came through. He had simply ordered his crew to rescue stations and pushed his ship to its absolute limits. Counselor Drex said that this was exactly the point that had impressed the Council so deeply, because Captain Bennett had not stopped to calculate potential profit or assess the risk to himself and his crew. He had not asked for authorization from Earth or demanded compensation in advance. He had simply acted because people needed help. The Counselor stated that the human ship had successfully saved all 4,000 Kelthian civilians who had been trapped on that dying colony transport, and when the Kelthian government had offered substantial financial compensation for the rescue, Captain Bennett had politely refused, and said that helping neighbors in trouble was just what decent people did. Counselor Veshtara added that the Council's research team had studied 63 similar incidents involving human military or civilian vessels over the past 5 years, and in every single case without exception, human forces had responded with the same immediate and selfless commitment to helping others, regardless of personal cost or danger. She said that humans fought in combat as if every single battle was their last stand, but they also saved lives as if every endangered person was a member of their own family, and this combination of ferocity and compassion was something the Council had never encountered before. Thexaron's translator carried a note of genuine warmth as he said that the Council had asked themselves a simple question during their deliberations, which was whether they would rather have humans as trusted allies or as unknown variables, and the answer had become obvious once they looked at the complete picture. Helen bowed her head respectfully and said that on behalf of all humanity, she accepted the Council's judgment and their trust, and she promised that humans would not disappoint them or betray the faith they were placing in Earth's warriors. The High Counselor said there was one more matter that needed to be discussed immediately, and his tone became more serious as he explained that a situation had developed which would test this new arrangement between humanity and the Council almost right away. He said that a hostile power called the Vortan Hegemony, which was not a member of the Council and operated from the Galactic South, had been conducting raids against colony worlds along the border regions for several months, and these raiders were slavers and pirates who were well-armed and completely ruthless in their methods. The holographic display changed to show a star chart with several solar systems marked in red to indicate danger zones, and Thexaron explained that Council peacekeeping forces had been unable to stop the Vortan raids effectively because the Council fleet was primarily designed for deterrence and patrol duties, rather than actual sustained combat. Operations. Counselor Drek spoke next, and his tone had become hard with anger. He said that the Vortan Hegemony had attacked a Dravos colony world just 2 days ago, killing 300 civilians in the initial assault and taking more than 2,000 captives, who were presumably going to be sold as slaves in markets beyond Council jurisdiction. Drex continued by saying that his people's defense forces had engaged the Vortan fleet and attempted to stop them, but the enemy ships were too heavily armed and their combat tactics were too brutal, and the Dravos vessels had been forced to retreat after taking significant damage. Daniel felt a familiar sensation spreading through his mind. It was the mental shift that every career soldier learned to recognize, the moment when you stopped being a diplomat or a politician and became purely a warrior focused on the mission ahead. He asked directly what the Council was requesting from humanity, wanting to hear the exact nature of the mission before making any commitments. Thexaron said carefully that the Council was asking if humanity would be willing to deploy their new rapid response fleet to deal with the Vortan threat, to show these slavers that Council worlds were protected by forces they could not overcome, and to rescue the captives if that was still possible. Helen and Daniel exchanged meaningful glances, both of them understanding that this was the critical moment that would define humanity's role in the galactic community for years or even decades to come. This was where theory became reality and promises were either kept or broken. Daniel asked how many ships humanity currently had within reasonable range of the crisis zone, and Sophie quickly checked her data tablet before reporting that the carrier group led by the UES Victory was approximately 4 days away at standard cruising speed. She listed the ships available, saying there were 3 destroyers and 6 frigates and 2 support vessels, with a total crew complement of roughly 8,000 personnel, including a full Marine expeditionary force. Counselor Drex warned that the Vortan fleet consisted of 12 warships, according to their latest intelligence, which meant the enemy would significantly outnumber the human force in terms of raw ship count. Daniel smiled, and it was not a pleasant or friendly expression. It was the cold smile of someone who had spent decades learning how to win battles against superior numbers, and he said that humanity had learned a very long time ago that victory was not about having more ships. It was about having better trained crews and the willingness to do whatever was necessary. Helen turned to face High Counselor Thexaron directly and said that Earth accepted this mission without hesitation or reservation, that they would deploy their forces immediately. However, she wanted to be absolutely clear about the rules of engagement that human forces would be operating under. She stated that humanity would offer the Vortan raiders one single opportunity to surrender peacefully and release their captives. But if the enemy refused this offer, then human forces would use whatever level of force was necessary to stop them and rescue the innocent people they had taken. Helen emphasized that the absolute priority would be saving lives, rather than minimizing damage to enemy ships or worrying about diplomatic niceties, and she said the council needed to understand and accept this before the mission began. Thexaren said that the council understood and officially approved these rules of engagement, and he added a traditional blessing from his culture, saying, "May fortune favor humanity's warriors in the coming battle." As the 3 human representatives left the council chamber and headed back to their quarters to begin mission preparation, Sophie spoke quietly and said that everything was going to change now. That humanity was no longer just another member species, but had become the protectors and defenders of the entire council. Helen replied that humans had always been protectors, that it was woven into their nature just like the warrior spirit, and she said that now the rest of the galaxy finally knew it too. Daniel was already thinking tactically, running through scenarios in his mind, and he said they needed to get a message to Admiral Kevin Price immediately because the carrier group would need to prepare for combat operations against an enemy that outnumbered them. Helen sent the encrypted communication while they walked, using her diplomatic authority to mark it as highest priority. And within minutes a response came back from the Victory. Admiral Price confirmed receipt of orders and stated that his task force was already accelerating toward the target zone and would be ready for combat in 72 hours. Sophie pulled up intelligence reports on her tablet as they entered their quarters, reading everything the council had on the Vortan hegemony, their ships, their tactics, their history, and she said that these slavers had been operating with impunity for years because no one had been willing or able to stop them effectively. Daniel said that was about to change in a very dramatic way, because the Vortan were about to learn what happened when you attacked someone under human protection. They were about to discover why humanity had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of warfare. Helen sat down and began drafting her official report to Earth, knowing that the government back home would need to be fully informed about everything that had happened today, about the Category 1 status, about the Rapid Response Fleet commitment, and about the immediate mission against the Vortan slavers. She wrote that humanity had been given an opportunity to prove themselves on the galactic stage, to show that their warrior nature could be a force for good rather than a source of fear, and she expressed confidence that Admiral Price and his crew would handle the situation with the professionalism and effectiveness, that the Earth Defense Force was known, for Daniel looked out the viewport at the stars, beyond, and thought about the Marines aboard the Victory, young men and women who had trained their entire adult lives for moments like this, and he felt a fierce pride in what humanity had become. Sophie finished reading the intelligence files and said that the Vortan had made a critical mistake by taking those Dravos colonists, because now they had given humanity both justification and motivation, and there was nothing more dangerous in the universe than humans with a righteous cause. Helen sealed her report and transmitted it back to Earth on the quantum communication channel. And then she said that all they could do now was wait and trust in the skills and courage of the men and women who would be facing the enemy. Daniel said that he did not doubt them for even a second, because they were human warriors, and human warriors had been defending the innocent and punishing the guilty since the very beginning of recorded history, and he said that the Vortan hegemony was about to learn this lesson the hard way. The 3 humans sat in their quarters and watched the stars, knowing that somewhere out there the UES Victory and her escort ships were racing toward battle, carrying with them the hopes of the Council and the reputation of all humanity.